listening to the most original talk radio station anywhere. We are LA Talk Radio at latalkradio.com.
You're listening to Fouché Way with Brandon Fouché, right here on LA Talk Radio.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for tuning in to the Fouché Way radio show, live every Thursday at 1 o'clock p.m., sponsored by the nonprofit organization called Canine Hope for Improvement Program, where we hope to improve the quality of our dogs' lives by moving towards a no-kill society. The number here is 818-602-4929. You know, whenever I work with a dog, I'm looking for their best quality, and I try to enhance that quality to get them through their troubled situation. But in order to effectively do this, there is a talent that they possess that I must not ignore if I am to be successful. And I'm talking about their superior nose, which makes them equal to none. Did you know their nose has 220 million receptors compared to our 5 to 10 million? You know, I want to talk about that a little. Because on one of my shows I mentioned this. They can sniff out certain cancer by simply smelling a person's breath or their urine. They have shown the ability to outperform the accuracy of an X-ray machine in a person's earliest form of cancer stage. And all of this information I'm revealing to you is documented. You can check it out. But I want to briefly explain how the mechanics of their nose works. You see, the moisture that's on a dog's nose, it captures odor molecules. The nostrils flare open to take in the scent, and there can be several scents that are taken in at one time. This is how they analyze their environment, much like we do with our eyes. And just beyond the nostrils, the air is cleaned and humidified, and it begins to travel through a maze of bony folds where the odor molecules are absorbed into the mucus layer. And just below the surface, they bind to what's called the olfactory cilia. And when these two meet, they generate nerve impulses that are transported by receptor neurons to the dog's light bulb in their brain, where the message is carried. And depending on what that message is, it will determine how that dog responds to stress. That's why it's important to put your dog under tension from time to time to keep them balanced. And I would like to go into that later at another time. But that's what makes them so fascinating, that 220 million receptors. That's why it's so important to mentally drain them rather than physically drain them. So when you hear me say mental energy is more draining than physical energy, you know why. See, when a dog is born into this world, he cannot see, he cannot hear, but he can smell. That's how he can find his mother to suck. It's the most important scent at the time of their life. We, the human, only talk to the nose when we are feeding or giving them a treat. But it's really, the nose is really the opening to where the hero lives within your dog. So in order for you to find this place, you must look with more interest and understanding of your dog and seek to explore deeper if we're going to cultivate a great dog-owner relationship. One of the ways that dogs have successful is through imitation. They imitate us. I mean, and really, this is how information is passed down from generation to generation, even with humans. That's why the wolf is so important. It allows us to appreciate the difference between it and the dog. Studies have shown that when wolves and dogs were raised side by side with humans, the wolf will take on many behaviors that the dog has when they greet humans. And what the studies found was, because of the many years of breeding for what we desire in our dogs, dogs look to humans for guidance. They take clues from us to survive. They need us. And so we have produced a creature that is dependent on us for its survival. And it is in that dependency that we see and feel love for them. So in the end of the experiments, we found that dogs' communicative skills were bred into them after they split from the wolf. And because we rewarded dogs for responding to our social cues, they survived to pass on their genes. And so the introduction to positive reinforcement was given life. And we became their new pack. That's why a dog will never revert to the wild state again, to become feral because of humans. We always will be there. And in our efforts to produce a dog, we were able to neutralize their wild state. I say neutralize because it's always laying dormant. That's why it's possible to reproduce it if we're not careful with what we do with them. We have come so far with their domestication, but our laws have become so restrictive for them that a dog cannot do what we originally bred them to do. We don't need him to hunt for us anymore or to protect us. So we became lost with what to do with our dogs. The training tools that we use to sharpen their hunting skills have become toys. And those toys have become stuffed animals. And those stuffed animals have become a false reality, an artificial world for them where we can still tap into their predatory instincts that they no longer legally are able to use as pets. You know, the majority of dogs, they don't have jobs that we originally created them for. So as the time moves on progressively with humans, so too should the dog. Let's start using their minds in a progressive way. Give up the desire to produce that prey drive and play educational games with them that cause them to think and solve problems, to be more like therapy dogs with each and every one of its owners. Learn to produce a more social creature that will use its mind to solve problems. And again, mental energy is more draining than physical energy. Now, there's going to become dogs that have to become smarter. We have to allow for them to grow up and get an education that will allow them to move into the future with us. And that means we're going to have to change the way we live with them. We have to think and make them better. Remember, they imitate us. And if we're not good leaders, they can't be good followers. Most of the negative news we see and hear today is the result of humans not being responsible for our creation. And so we create all of this legislation to make people believe we need to control the nature of dogs. You know, I've been around long enough to have gone through the different stages that we have with the different power breeds. And we have always had the same problems, and it has always been people. It has always been people. And now, you know, at this point, I'm going to give most people a pass here. Because the people that don't know any better, the ones that are innocent with their knowledge and their behavior, the ones that just love their dogs and they do everything they were told to do because they were reading it in a book, I'm going to give them a pass. But now I'm going to tell you something. And you have to be responsible for this knowledge. You have to be responsible for the knowledge that you seek. The books were written based on the working dogs, not the pets that we have today. It wasn't designed for people who were treating their dogs like the children in every shape, form, or fashion. You can't tap into a killing mentality day in and day out and expect to get a therapy dog. How can we blame them when we wake up that hormone in them with our games? You know, we turn them into the very thing that gets them into trouble. I have always heard people say there are no bad dogs. They're just bad people. But what does it matter if the person has already created the neurotic behavior in the dog? It's up to us to right this wrong. Look, man, I'm talking to the fosters, adopters, volunteers, and the institutions. We all have to work together and be responsible for what we're teaching our dogs. There's no contamination in the air or the water that's making our dogs act the way they do. We're the contaminant. We can't look anywhere other than ourselves. And I know it's probably difficult to accept this because there's a side of you that says, what can we do if we're not playing these predatory games? And the answer is education. Educational games, making them more social with the things that are surrounding your life. We didn't know it, but training wasn't it. Every time I see a person practicing their training, they're doing it to avoid situations which ultimately prevent a dog from socializing. And we didn't realize it at the time because that's all we had to work with. We were told to make them sit, make them down, make them stay. We prevent them from investigating, and so we end up creating the wrong kinds of stress. Because we were going against the mental state that the dog was in at the time we gave him the command. And we neglected to explain to the dog why we did it. Thinking all along that we were creating a social creature, but we were practicing avoidance work. And a lot of our dogs that are in the shelter today are there because they're misunderstood what we wanted. You know, I remember in the year 2003, Cincinnati spent over $500,000 enforcing the ban on pit bulls. And at that time, they killed nearly 400. Other cities killed hundreds too, other than Cincinnati. And this is all public record. Check it out, man. And so my show today is a little different. I'm not talking to an individual about a problem with their dog and how things are getting better, but I'm talking to an individual about why things aren't getting better with our dogs in our system. She's a person that is actually in a dogfight with the system, and she's trying to make a change in the system that is slow to change. She's a person that's been on the show before as a legal analyst, and, I don't know about you, but I like people who tell it like it is. Whether you like it or not, it is what it is, man. And in my business with working with aggression, you got to deal with it for what it is. You got to be as sober as the judge and have the facts to back up what you say and what you can do, and be able to tell the people what they didn't know so they can get their situation right. And so we're going to talk about something that I didn't know. They are related to animals that I love and care for, and so I'm very interested in having my questions answered. And I'm very excited to have, once again, animal attorney Marla Tauser on the show today. Marla, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Brandon?
I'm doing just great. I mean, I'm really excited today because today I kind of get a chance to listen to the other side. Usually I'm working with people that come to my place that are seeking help, that really want to know what to do. So it's not that difficult. All I have to do is be able to give them, the road in which they need to go and make it, plain so that they can understand why they shouldn't be doing this and why they should be doing that. And so the questions that I want to ask you today is about the other side of that, why things aren't working. And, I talk to a lot of volunteers from time to time. I run into them. There are a lot of volunteers around and a lot of fosters. And I have a question. My first question to you is, why are volunteers having problems working with shelters? Can you kind of explain that? And do you find that that's a problem?
Yeah, I get quite a few calls from volunteers at various shelters, predominantly around Southern and Central California. volunteering or trying to volunteer at public shelters, and either hitting roadblocks trying to become volunteers or hitting roadblocks after they've started volunteering, and very often getting, I guess, fired, for lack of a better word, in their volunteer efforts.
Well, let me back up really quick. You mean there's a problem becoming a volunteer? You can't just come and become a volunteer?
No. The procedure very often is incredibly cumbersome. In fact, it might be easier to get into the CIA or the FBI. It's not uncommon for these public entities to put up all kinds of barriers to becoming volunteers, although they say that they really encourage volunteers and they really love volunteers, and they always put out statements saying that they really value their volunteers and that they're most important part of their shelters and systems. And the reality couldn't be more different. Very often, for example, I was just recently speaking with a woman. It took her 5 months to get through the application process in the city of Rancho Cucamonga at their shelter. And that's not uncommon, unfortunately. It generally requires a background check that's far more intrusive and extensive than it probably should be. And what happens, too, is even if you're going to a shelter to become a dog walker, I mean, you're not even going to interact with money, records, or anything that could even be construed as, having some sort of privacy right for anybody. If you just want to go walk dogs, they will put you through a background check that's really, really extensive. They want to know pretty much everything about you, and which is a little bit overkill, and is not generally all that welcoming. Once you get past that, there's very often, they call it an interview process. I call it more of an interrogation. In some instances, some shelters I've dealt with, they have had a panel of people, sometimes the police chief, the shelter director, and one or two other people that fire questions at you. And the questions range from, they really want to know sort of what your philosophical beliefs are. Typically, they'll ask you how you feel about euthanasia or killing of animals. And if you express that you don't think that's a good idea, very often you'll be next from the list. You're just not eligible.
So this is not about whether you're going to take a dog out and steal him.
No. Oh, no. No, it has nothing there. I don't even think they're worried about you taking a dog out and stealing them to speak of. No, it's more about whether or not you're going to be the good little silent volunteer, hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil, and don't ever ask any questions. Just do as you're told and don't tell anyone what's going on. In fact, a number of these places have, which I find just bizarre, they, before you become a volunteer, will require you to sign a confidentiality and non-disclosure agreement.
Wow.
Basically saying that you will never tell, and you will certainly never speak to the media in any capacity, including online and social media, about anything you see in there, which to me is shocking. If they're doing what they say they're doing, why don't they want people to talk about it?
Wow, I would think the interview process was about whether you abused animals in the past or that sort of thing. So,
no,
man, that's okay. So,
and that's just getting in. That's just before you start.
Interesting.
Once you start it, then the games begin.
So, what do you mean?
In a lot of places.
What exactly do you mean?
Well, for example, if you say things or you ask questions about maybe some of their policies, procedures, specific animals. If you point out, for example, that you've noticed that maybe several of the cats don't have water, or that their kennels are dirty. If you start to just sort of rock the boat even a little bit, that's not good. You're not going to be welcome.
So what kind of things happen to volunteers? I mean, let's say you're in the
depending
system.
on how far they go. For example, I've been working, with some people, and this is not an uncommon situation, who have posted some videos of animals online. They posted beautiful videos of some animals that were highly adoptable. And this was in another city. This was in the city of Rancho Cucamonga again. And they posted videos of the animals that were killed. I won't say euthanized, because euthanized indicates that they were killed to be put out of misery. These were perfectly healthy, happy animals until they were killed. And they posted videos of these animals online and said, just said that they were killed. That was the truth.
Oh, you mean
they were terminated. 4 of them were terminated as volunteers.
I see.
And that was given as a reason for terminating them, was posting information on social media. Mm-hmm. But there was nothing untrue about what they said.
Well, I mean, I'm sure people understand that sometimes you bring a dog into the shelter, they're not going to get adopted. They stand a good chance of being destroyed. And so since that's already known, why is that a big problem?
Why is what a big problem? Posting about it?
Well, yeah, I mean, that this dog was killed, I mean...
Because these shelter directors want to give people the impression that all is okay in their world and that they only kill animals that need to be killed. They come up with these rationalizations and justifications, and they like to make the claim that they only kill animals that they categorize as unadoptable, and I use that term loosely. Mm-hmm. And the term unadoptable has come to mean pretty much anything they want it to mean. There's no real definition, although a lot of them like to say, well, it had behavior issues or it had medical issues, and generally they won't elaborate on them, even if you see the records for these animals. Mm-hmm. They won't elaborate on what rendered this animal unadoptable. But they like to give the impression that, we only, and they'll even skew their statistics such that they won't include those animals that they deemed unadoptable in their kill numbers. So it's all sort of a shell game. It's sort of like, well, we only had to kill them because they were unadoptable. We didn't have a choice. When in actuality, that's very often not the case.
So,
but it sounds better.
So is this something that is pretty much going on around all shelters with volunteers? I mean, they go through they have a process that they go through, and it has nothing to do with whether you're able to walk a dog or whether you're an abuser of a dog or whether you're trying to steal a dog. This is about protecting certain interests is what you're finding. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say that it's all shelters. I think that's a bit too broad, but I think it's a very common issue in many particularly public facilities. Yeah, It's a very common thing.
All right.
It's not uncommon, that's for sure. I can't say in all of them because I haven't been to all of them and I haven't studied the records in all of them.
Okay.
But certainly I find that it's not uncommon.
All right. Well, that's interesting. I mean, for those people who are out there that think that, they want to walk dogs and they go to the shelter and they find that they got to be interviewed as to whether they can walk dogs or not, maybe we'll have someone on that might talk about that experience or something. I don't know, but that's new to me.
Well, I don't want to discourage people from trying. What I'm trying to do is change the system and bring about some transparency in this. I don't want to discourage people from trying. I think people should. I mean, volunteers are an essential part of shelters.
Okay. Yeah, I believe they are. I believe they're a very intricate part of it because a lot of the volunteers are the ones that are going to be able to tell people how these dogs really are because they're spending time with them.
They're the ones who have the time to interact with a lot of these animals.
Absolutely. They have a very unique and very powerful position there, so I would hate to see them discouraged from the shelters.
There's also a lot of tension typically between employees and volunteers. And there's very often a friction between the two, and it's very often fostered by other interests within the shelter, and you end up almost with the two factions at war in a lot of situations.
Yeah, I can kind of see that. But all right, look, I have another question. I've always been interested in the effectiveness of this microchip. So tell us about that. What's going on? How does this microchip system work?
The microchip is a really simple process. It's a really simple piece of equipment. It's a small device that's about the size of a grain of rice that's typically implanted in an animal between the shoulder blades, just under the skin.
Right.
It can be read with a scanner. Most shelters should have, I don't say they do, but most should have what's called a universal scanner. There are two or three big manufacturers of these microchips that are used nationwide, and then there are some smaller ones as well. And in theory, the universal scanner should be able to read all of them. You scan for the microchip when an animal comes in, when it's impounded into the shelter, or in the field, for example. They should also be scanning in the field. If a field services officer goes out and sees a stray, they should have a scanner with them in their vehicle, and they should scan the animal and see if there is an owner. See if the microchip company, what happens when you scan is a number comes up in a screen. Mm-hmm. And that number will indicate the manufacturer of the microchip and the database that corresponds with that microchip. It's a really simple process.
I found, though, some dogs that it didn't pick it up.
Well, you can't scan it really quickly, and you also have to be careful the way you scan. It's not you have to scan. Sometimes you have to scan 2 or 3 times, but you have to do it slowly, and it's not always going to be right where they implanted the microchip. It can move. It can migrate a little bit.
Okay, and then there's different scanners too, right?
There are different scanners. Yeah. There are,
and that could be a problem.
Well, typically they should be using, in theory, like I said, they should be using a universal scanner that should pick up the signal from any of the microchips.
Okay. So then what goes wrong? I hear people talk about all the time, my dog was chipped and they said that they were here and now they're not here.
Well, for example, I'll give you an example. Like when they find a microchip, at the shelter, they're required by law, under California state law, they are required to scan for microchips and to make reasonable efforts to identify the owner. Now, the protocol that's been set out by one of the biggest companies, which is Avid, it specifically says in their brochure how the system works, that the shelter will call Avid's 24-hour hotline, and Avid will search their database, because the way it's supposed to work is when you have a microchip, you contact the microchip company as the pet owner, and you always keep your contact information updated with that one entity, with the microchip company. If you move, you call them, or you fill out the paperwork, you let them know. If your phone number changes, you let them know. And the point of it was to streamline the process such that you didn't have to notify every animal control entity in which you've ever lived and keep them updated of any changes. So this way it's one-stop shopping. You call one place, and you give them your information. If it changes, that's the only place you should, need to change your information. Where it goes wrong is a number of ways. One of the most common is, a microchip is only as good as the person on the other end. Some places, some shelters, they just don't scan for whatever reason. Just a couple weeks ago, there was a situation in another shelter, in a public shelter, where a woman's cat was actually impounded in the field. It was trapped, apparently, by we don't know exactly who. The field officer didn't scan for a microchip. They brought it into the shelter, didn't scan for a microchip. The cat was there for weeks. The woman had gone there. She had, several times, didn't see her cat. Suddenly, her cat appeared on a pet adoption website. She went down there, and they said, "Oh, whoopsie, we didn't scan your cat. So sorry. Here's your cat." Her cat could have been dead. She was very lucky. And she only found out that through sheer perseverance. Or you have a situation like the city of Los Angeles.
So wait. Before you get there, so I want to understand. I want to stay in line with you. So you're saying, okay, a dog or a cat comes in, and you're saying when you're looking for your dog, or is the person supposed to call the microchip company, or are they supposed or they go to the shelter?
Yes. No. Here's what happens. The animal comes into the shelter. The shelter worker scans for the microchip. They then contact the microchip company that has the database and has the information, and that is encoded into the chip number. You can tell from the chip which company it is. You call the number, and they tell the shelter worker the name of the owner and the phone number that they have on file. It's that simple. And then the shelter worker can call the person and say, "Hey, we have your dog or we have your cat." It's that simple.
Good.
If everyone does what they're supposed to, but you can't always count on that happening.
You mean?
For example, the city of Los Angeles has developed their own program for using microchips, and I don't think most people know. I only found out accidentally. The city of Los Angeles on their website still tells you that it says each chip has a unique number that is registered with a national database along with the pet owner's address and phone number. They say that if a microchip is found when an animal comes to their shelter, that they will contact the microchip manufacturer. They also go on to say on their website, if you move, it is very important to change your address with the microchip company. However, that's not the way they use microchips. Their official policy is to scan for a microchip and then to first go to their own computer records. And they have their own records for whatever reason, whether maybe the microchip was implanted in an animal there before it was adopted out. But in any event, they are going to use the information they have in their records regardless of how old that information is and regardless of whether that information is accurate. That's what they're going to use. They will only call the microchip company if they don't already have information about that microchip in their own records. So essentially, they've relegated the microchip database to a secondary position, to sort of a backup plan, instead of the primary plan, which is the way they tell you they're going to use it. So they're really not telling the truth. And this is a problem because if the information in their database is old or belongs to the previous owner, or to a rescuer, or to somebody else, that's the person they're going to contact regardless. You could have your information completely current with the microchip company, but if they have different information in their database in the city of LA, that's the person who's going to get contacted. To make things worse, their official operating procedure is to not call the purported owner, but to send a letter, to mail a letter to the owner saying you have 7 days to come get your animal.
But that's out there.
Now, where this becomes a problem, for example, is I'll give you a good example. I lived in the city of Los Angeles. My dogs were licensed in the city of Los Angeles. I recently moved outside of the city of Los Angeles. But and of course the microchip company has all of my current information. Now, I recently moved. I don't have to license my animals in LA anymore. But if I, for example, take one of my dogs running in Griffith Park and something happens and she gets impounded in the city of Los Angeles, they're not going to call the microchip company. They're going to go to their database. They're going to find my name and my old address in their database, and they're going to mail a letter to my old address telling me that I have 7 days to come and get my dog. When what they really should do is call the microchip company and call me, and I will immediately go and get my dog. But that's not the way they do it. Whoa. And I don't know how many other agencies do it like that, but that's a huge problem, especially when you don't tell people that's the way you're going to do it.
That's a big problem. That's a huge problem.
It's a huge problem. Why have microchips at all if you're not going to use them properly? There is no reason to have them. And I think people need to know this. They need to start asking their local animal control entities, how do you use microchips? What is your protocol? Where are your operations manuals? Where are the instructions?
Interesting.
I did not know that, and I only found out by accident when a client's dog went to the wrong person.
Well, I'm going to move on to my second question. That's some good information. I'm going to move on to my third question here, which is one that, a lot of people I hear all the time. What's happening with dogs that are being taken out of the shelter and transported somewhere else and getting adopted? I mean, is there a shortage of dogs somewhere else? What's going on with that? What's happening with the numbers?
I'm not really aware of a shortage anywhere. I hear of these transports. Part of the problem when you're dealing with public shelters, again, is these animals are being transported out, but they don't tell you where they're going necessarily. And if they're being done through another entity, for example, a nonprofit group, which happens in the city of LA as well, if they're being done through that group and that group is then transferring them out, the city will claim that it has some sort of privacy interest and that nonprofit doesn't need to be identified, and they make it impossible to get the records. They won't provide records. The answer to that is no one really knows. So, no one really knows where they're going. We don't know if they're getting adopted on the other end. I don't know. No one really knows. It's sort of another closely held secret.
Well, so what does that do with the numbers in the shelter then?
Well, it's great because for the numbers, what's happened in recent years is there's been more scrutiny on sort of, public shelters and what really happens and what's really going on. So a lot of shelters have moved away. They've gotten into the sort of practice of creative accounting. And they've done really a lot of smoke and mirrors, and what they've done is they've sort of just changed a lot of the column headings on their spreadsheets, if you will. So what used to be considered an adoption, which was I go to a shelter, I take a dog out, I've adopted that dog. Now they've cobbled together this sort of category, this nebulous category of what some call live outcomes, some call, total outcomes or whatever. And it sort of includes a whole lot of other things. It includes adoptions. It includes transports. It includes animals sent to foster homes. It includes animals taken by rescue groups. So it really makes that live outcome number may become higher when in fact we don't really know that they're live outcomes. But it sounds better. So they get to really inflate the numbers and really brag about getting closer to no kill when in fact they haven't, in a lot of cases, changed anything that they're actually doing other than change the accounting and the column headings. You know, when you ship a number of animals through a private organization out of town or to some parts unknown, and you get to put those in your adoption column, nobody really knows what those numbers are, but it can inflate those numbers sometimes 20%. So suddenly you have better adoption figures, but you really don't. It just looks better.
I mean, well, so who is that looking better to? I mean, the public?
Oh, to the public, sure. It's a lot of sugarcoating. Yeah, it's sort of sugarcoating, and it sounds better because then they can come up with these grandiose sort of slogans and PR campaigns, and there's a lot of donations come in on this. There's a lot of money riding on this.
So let me get this right. So here's a person brings their dog into the shelter, and most people are thinking when they bring their dogs into the shelter, whether it's reality or not, that Fluffy's gonna get a new home. And that's their take on it. They think, well, you know, whatever my problem was, I don't have it anymore. I returned the dog to the shelter, and the shelter's going to find a home for the dog.
Yeah.
And they, more times than not, it's not going to happen.
No. That's the image that a lot of these places have been trying to portray for a number of years, and it's certainly not something that they would downplay. In fact, some have, you know, flat out lied and called themselves no kill when they're nowhere near no kill.
Well, how do you call yourself no kill? I mean, a dog comes into the shelter, you take it in, or you don't take it in? Is that how it works? And then that way. No,
public shelters have to. They can't, you know, they're not allowed to just sort of turn them away, depending, you know.
Okay.
So you know, those are what are called open admission shelters. You know, how do you call yourself no kill? Well, I guess until you get caught. You know, until someone figures out that you really aren't. You know?
That reminds me, you know, I was in the restaurant business, and I remember this guy who was managing a restaurant, and he says, well, how are things going? He says, well, you know, you just fake it till you get it right.
Yeah. Or, you know, in some cases, you just call yourself no kill by changing all your column headings.
Okay.
You know, just do this creative accounting. You're just really, you know, you haven't really changed anything you're doing. And in a lot of those cases, you know, those things, those animals that are making out alive are making it out not because the directors and the staff have implemented these great new programs. They're making it out in spite of directors and employees and management, not because of them. In other words, because rescues have become more assertive and they have become more vocal, because more people are willing to foster and things like that. But at the same time, it makes the directors and everybody else look better, and they can, you know, toot their own horns and say, yay, look what a great job we're doing, when in fact they haven't done anything. In fact, many of them do whatever they can to dissuade rescues, to try to keep them out, because very much like with the volunteers, they can buy the silence of rescuers by threatening to revoke their right to pull animals from the shelters if they break the code of silence. So there's this sort of veil of secrecy that surrounds these places, and you know, until a volunteer or a rescuer, you know, leaves or is fired, they really generally won't talk because they're afraid to lose their privileges.
Well, look, everything that's done, I understand, is supposed to be, you know, a public record because of where it is. And so that means that anybody can go and find this information out, right?
In theory.
What do you mean?
I have piles of letters, responses from city attorneys, county councils, city clerks, all justifying reasons they can't give me information. From, you know, that's private, to we don't have that information, to, well, we could get you the information. One of my favorites is most of these places use a computer system called Chameleon. It's a very expensive, it's a sophisticated program that tracks just about everything that goes on in a shelter.
Okay.
Yet, if I ask them for records, say, for 1 month worth of animals, actually, I'll give you a perfect example. Last year, I requested the records for 1 week's worth of animals from the Downey shelter, the LA County system. 1 week. And I realize that's a number of animals. That's quite a few animals, but it's all in a computer. It took 2.5 months for them to produce those records. These are in a computer. Someone did not have to stand there and handwrite all of these things. Mm-hmm. But they make it sound like it's so labor intensive. And I've got letters from county councils and from city attorneys saying, you do realize that if our staff has to do this, they'll be diverted. You know, it's taking an entire staff to produce these records, which I find absolutely shocking. Because I've gone into other shelters and I've asked for a specific record about an animal, and they can produce the entire record in less than 15 seconds. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's essentially just a way to say, no, you can't have it. And they really hope that all but the strong will just go away. You really have to be persistent. The other way they do it is by trying to make you prepay, which is not legal, although they all claim it is. They claim that the Public Records Act has a provision that allows them to require prepayment for these. And sometimes it's $700 or $800. Wow. And they'll say, I have, letters from, I'm thinking of a particular county and city, different places, that both essentially said, well, we're going to try to get those records to you in, 8 or 10 weeks, and only if you pay us, it was over $700 in advance. And what I always request is the actual records. What they want to produce is some sanitized report that omits critical information. And in looking and analyzing the data from the actual impound records for each animal, I can tell how many laws are being violated and what's really happening. But they don't want to give me that information. It's the bottom line.
Because you can tell that information.
Yeah, it's that... Well, say one thing, but we're not going to prove it.
So what you're saying then, what I'm getting from this, if someone in the public wanted to find out some information, that's going to be so difficult that they have to hire someone like you to get that information. Is that what you're saying?
Not necessarily. I mean, they'll give you sort of bits and pieces of information. Like if you just wanted the information on 1 or 2 animals, typically what they're going to do is start off with a letter, that says, that they're required to produce within 10 days of receiving your request, and it's just sort of a general catch-all, okay, we may or may not have this record, and we'll give it to you eventually. And they just hope that you'll go away. And if you're just looking for 1 or 2 records, you may or may not get them eventually. But if you're looking to really look through enough information to see what's going on, they're not too happy. Most of them, certainly that I've dealt with in Southern California, have not been happy to produce this material, and generally come up with a lot of excuses for why they can't.
Well, I mean, that's mind-blowing, because you would think, something being public record, that you would just be able to even just go up on the computer and log in and get that information, or make a phone call.
You can go online. A lot of these places publish their cleaned up, sanitized reports online, but they don't give you the raw data. They don't, it's just a report in sort of in a spreadsheet form, but you don't know what the input was into that. For example, you can't tell from there, there's a state-mandated minimum hold time for stray animals. Now, they can say, okay, but that's whether or not they held the animal for long enough is not going to show up in their sanitized report, because they don't have those columns in there. And also it won't show whether or not that animal was actually made available for adoption. I mean, maybe they held it for the required time, but they never made it available for adoption. They just killed it as soon as they could. And that's evident from really analyzing the records from the raw data. But it's not in their cleaned up, sanitized reports. I mean, I fought with one county for 8 months with county council in Kern County, trying to get records, and all they kept doing was playing games and just producing these reports, even though I very specifically had sent the exact documents that I wanted. I sent them samples from records, from a few records I had gotten from them earlier in that year. I sent them those documents and said, these are exactly what I want for every animal. And months later, I got a notice, from them saying, oh, here, we've produced these records for you. And then they were nothing like what I had asked for. And they had nowhere near the detail that I needed. And they, in fact, didn't even have the ultimate disposition of the animal. It didn't even say if the animal was adopted, killed, died in a shelter, transferred, or taken by a rescue. They just left that out, which obviously is pretty useless.
Man, that's interesting. Time is rolling, but I want to get to my last question, and really, you're in there now, and I'm talking about transparency and accountability. What's up?
Two of my favorite words. It's
Really?
the only thing that I want in animal sheltering right now. Transparency and accountability. Why won't they tell us what they're doing? When you can make all the claims in the world. You can say everything you want, but if you're not willing to back it up with the facts and the information, why should anyone believe you? And unfortunately, this is taxpayer money that's being spent to fund these places. This isn't, I'm not talking about private facilities. That they run by a whole different set of rules. But when the taxpayers are funding these places, the taxpayers have a right to know what is going on. These entities do not have a right to withhold that information. And there's a lot of money. These are, if you really look at the salaries, and I encourage people to do this, look at the salaries of city and county shelter employees, salaries, benefits. They're not underpaid.
Oh, you mean the people?
There's a lot of money.
Just the shelter people working there, you mean?
Oh, yeah. Shelter people, management, from the bottom up.
Well,
they're making a lot more money than a lot of people.
That's public knowledge, too, right?
Oh, it's public information, sure. Okay. Sure. Go on their websites. Check it out. Wow. But, why are they not transparent? Why aren't they saying what's going on? I mean, when I can get my hands on records, like I said, I can see patterns of violations of law. And I think part of it is that there's no accountability. What is the penalty for not obeying these laws?
Is there?
What is the recourse that people have? And when you have city officials and county officials who are either as blinded as the public or intentionally ignorant, which I see too. There are plenty of public officials who just toe the line and say, gee, this place is great, and you can go to them and complain and complain and complain and point out the deficiencies and point out the violations of law, and they just sit there and say that everything is great. I mean, they'll tell you straight to your face that everything is fine, no problem here, nothing to look at, folks. And you can point out to them with their own records where they're violating laws, and they just want to ignore you. It's really incredible. It's pretty mind-blowing, really. It's a pretty impressive talent to be able to be faced with facts like that and just with a straight face say there's no problem. And I see it. I've seen it in a number of cities and counties, because I think part of it is that nobody wants to think that their particular municipality or jurisdiction is inhumane and is treating its animals badly. But the fact is, a lot of them are.
Well, what do you think? Why is that? Why do you think that's happening? Because a lot of people will say, I don't believe that that's happening. But you've got the numbers, and you've tried to get these records, and you've been juggled around.
I have a lot of records. Right. I do have a lot. I've been very persistent.
So why do you think this is happening?
I think there are a number of reasons. I think part of it is just laziness. It's easier to keep doing what you've been doing. I think part of it is there's no real penalties for failing to abide by these laws. I mean, the only recourse a person would have really is to file a lawsuit, which is extremely time-consuming and extremely expensive. And then what? I mean, a number of these places have been sued, and they go right back to what they were doing as soon as the pressure's off or as soon as the court order to monitor them is over, as soon as the time's expired. They go right back to what they were doing before. Because there's no penalty. The county board of supervisors or the city councils, they don't penalize these directors that are doing these things.
So what do you think?
They don't get fired.
What do you think is needed? What do you think we need to do?
I think, again, we need transparency and accountability. We need these places to start telling the truth. And we need people to know what's really going on. Because to my mind, it's really, really hard to talk about reform unless you're willing to get honest about where you are.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what I do for a living. I mean, we've got to be as honest. I mentioned earlier in the show, honest as a judge, man. We've got to be able to stand up and tell the people what they need to know so that they can go about getting their stuff together.
Yeah, I mean, shelter reform has become a really hot topic in the last several years. And in all fairness, it is going on in some places. Mm-hmm. But the places where it's been successful and where they really are moving to a no-kill model, which is achievable, but that's for a whole different show, right. Where they're doing that, they have been willing to get honest. The leadership of the shelters, the leadership of the cities or counties have been willing to say, hey, we're not doing this right. Something is wrong. Let's talk about what's wrong. And then to build on that foundation. But if you're only going to do it as a sort of a sideshow and as sort of to cover up what's going on, there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of talk about it, mm-hmm. but nothing really changing in a number of these places. And if you don't divulge the information through the public records, then no one really knows.
Wow.
You make it impossible to find out the truth. I've said for a long time, if the directors of these places, these really badly run places, spent half as much time actually doing what they say they do, rather than lying about it or finding excuses not to or finding excuses not to follow laws, those places could be pretty decent. They could really improve. But instead, they're putting all this effort into skirting the laws and sidestepping and a lot of fancy footwork and a lot of creative accounting.
Wow. Well, Marla, the time is rolling. And like I said in the beginning of the show, man, I really like people who tell it like it is. Whether you like what you're hearing or not, it is what it is. And that's what you do. And you are for the dog. You are a dog lover. And you're out there trying to make this thing happen, man. And we need people like you. We need people to get behind you. I know you're doing some things that we're not talking about right now that we will talk at a later date that's going to help people that are going through these kinds of problems. But I just want to thank you for coming on and giving us that information. I totally have been enlightened. There's some things that I didn't know, and I'm sure there are people who are listening that feel the same way. But this is not the end. Of course, we'll continue to talk about these kinds of things because we're trying to make this right. And I want to be a part of making this system right. And so I want to thank you for coming on, Marla, and we will talk to you soon. And thank the listeners. You're welcome. Thanks to the listeners for tuning into the Fouché Way Radio Show. And we will see you again next Thursday at 1 o'clock p.m.
You're listening to Fouché Way with Brandon Fouché, right here on LA Talk Radio.